1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so we have now our next session, which is about inflation. Today is 23 of April. And we are gonna start talking about the difference between real and nominal figures, okay? So to start talking about that, which is related also with the concept of inflation, let's go back with a basic concept that is tied with the idea of the circular flow of the economy. So if you remember, we were talking about how there's a real flow, which is the factors of production on the one side, and then the goods and services produced by the companies back to the houses. And this is the real flow because we're talking about in-kind process and goods and services and factors, okay? But we said that in a market economy, we have money to make the transactions more dynamic. So we have this financial flow or the monetary flow. So if we think about these two flows, then we can just put them here as in the image is telling us. So let's think about everything that the economy produces. So it's actually all the goods and services that an economy produces over a certain period of time. And we're talking about everything, okay? We're talking about Coca-Colas, and we're talking also about cars, but also we're talking about education and maybe flowers and food. Everything that the country produces will be the real flow of income. But then we have, on the other hand, the money that the country needs to make the interactions or the transactions in a market-based system. So we have actually the amount of money that a country has should match in a certain amount to what the country produce, okay? So it's going to be a little bit more complicated to explain the details about how the money is being created and how much money should be circulating in an economy. That's not really, not even the purpose of this class, but also is not something that we need to study right now. Later in the university, you may have a financial and a money topic that it takes 6 months to understand more the process. But just to simplify it, we have here the amount of money in circulation that has to be issued by a certain institution, okay? So it's not just anyone that can print money and just put it in circulation. The institution that is in charge of issuing money or injecting money into circulation is the central bank of a country, okay? We call it the central bank. Sometimes it's called the public bank. Very unlikely to call it in general, but we call it central banks. And in the USA, it's also called the Fed, okay? So the Federal Bureau of Credit and Money. Some countries actually call it also the board, the monetary board, but we will refer it as the central bank of a country. The central bank is a public institution. It's usually comprised of different members of different stakeholders in the economy. Sometimes it's the Minister of Economics, the Minister of Finance, some other delegates from the government. They include usually a representative from the business sector, a representative from the unions. So it's a board comprised of many members that they take technical decisions. And I mean technical decisions because they have a focus and they have a mandate. The amount of money in circulation should be technically matching the amount of goods and services that the economy is producing, okay? So later we will talk a little bit more about political economy and actually what is the goal of issuing more or less money. But we may say in a very simplistic and superficial way right now, but it's important to understand it, is that the amount of money in circulation should be matching with the amount of goods and services. And also, if the economy is producing more, then the money issued should also be increasing, or there should be more money in circulation. If the economy is producing less for some reasons, the economy is contracting, then the money in circulation should also be contracted at a certain level, so we don't have more money in circulation than what the economy is really producing. The difference between that is important because if we are thinking about, let's say, a country that it just prints money, it just wants to print more money and more money and more money. So more money is printed and issued in a country, but the amount of goods and services is not really increasing. What we will see is that the prices of these goods and services are going to be higher. So now you have $2 or $3 that are backing up just one Coca-Cola, instead of $1 backing up one Coca-Cola. I'm simplifying the idea, but just so we know, so we see visually how it works. If there's more money in circulation, then the Coca-Cola will be backed up by more money. So that means that inflation will take place. In other words, the value or the price of each good produced is going to be having more monetary value. And that's actually the concept that we will talk about inflation a little bit later on today. So once we have this in mind and we see how the money has to be matching with the trends of the real economy, then we can move on to talk a little bit about all the policies related with inflation and all the policies related with recessions and trying to increase the production of an economy, if that is the case. Let's see this idea, prices change over time. So what do you think about this? Prices decrease over time, prices increase over time. What we are definitely saying is that prices are not stable over time. So usually we think that prices increase over time. There are different reasons why that happens. One of the reasons is that resources become more limited and more goods are being produced. So that means that there's more pressure on the prices of the goods because the factors of production are actually used at its full capacity. That's one reason. But there are other reasons that we may think why prices changes over time. And we will explore that in detail when we go to the concept of inflation a little bit more deeper next year. Let's see what this slide is telling us. So let's look at the information that I retrieved actually from a webpage from the USA showing the prices of cornflakes, just this product, okay? In 1943, 11 ounces of cornflakes was 8 cents. But then in the 88, what you can see here as the years go by, the same amount has been changing in prices, okay? Some years have been keeping stable, but usually what we see is that the prices have been increasing. Well, we have here a decrease in the price, which is unusual. Then it went up again. Now we have the same price here in 2004, but now we have less amount. So actually the presentation is less, but the price remains the same. So that means that the cost or the price of this good is actually increasing as well because now you are receiving less with the same amount of money. Here the prices remain stable between 2004 and 2008. But if we look at 2020, we may find that this price has increased, okay? So in general, what I wanted to portray with this slide is that prices overall of all goods and services, in general, in average, if we put here time and we have here prices, they will actually show upwards trend, okay? So prices keep increasing over time. There's going to be a delta or a proportional change that is positive. Of course, there are fluctuations some years, as we have seen here. Sometimes goes down, sometimes go up higher. Sorry, but in general, prices go up. So let's define inflation. Inflation can be defined as a sustained increase in the general price level. Make sure that you have this in mind. We're talking about all the price level of the economy, not just cornflakes. So we're talking about cornflakes and flowers and cars and universities and everything that a country produces. In general, in average, the prices of all these goods have do increase. That is what we call inflation. What is one of the consequences of inflation? That as long as the income remains fixed, let's just put that as a cause of one of the problems. If the income is not matching up with the increase of the prices, then we have a situation that the purchasing power of money is less. So in other words, actually you are going to be needing to pay more for the same amount of goods. That is one of the consequences of inflation. Need to pay more money with the same amount of goods. But also now let's go back to this idea. If your income is remaining the same and you have to pay more for the amount of goods, then that means that you have to work more hours to actually buy the same amount of goods, unless your income is matched with the same increase of the price level of the economy. If your income is matched with the same increase of the price level, then that means that you are actually earning in proportion the same amount that you need to buy more goods and services. Now, at the end of the day, still the purchasing power of each dollar or each unit of monetary currency that we're talking loses its value, because now you need 2 or you need 3 to buy the package of cornflakes, or to buy the car that you need to buy, or to buy the gasoline that you need to buy. Now the purchase power of the currency is lower because the prices have gone up. Inflation is generally measured from one year to the next year. So when we are talking from a timeline, we are talking about inflation taking place from the former year, 2018, to 2019 to 2020. So the inflation rate is usually measured from one year to the next one. It's very unlikely that we see, oh, the inflation rate from 1990 to 2020. Well, we don't really use that as the inflation concept. We use the inflation concept as from the last period of time compared to the new period of time. So that's what we really read when we read a newspaper or any information that is given to us. If it says the inflation rate is 3%, oh, we're assuming that it's 3% from the last year, okay? Unless it said otherwise. Some countries actually are very good in having statistics, and they capture the increase or the change in prices from month to month, okay? Sometimes it's from quarter to quarter, so every 3 months, they measure the price level and they see, oh, inflation is changing or is increasing by, let's say, 2%, 1% from the first quarter to the second quarter, etc. Okay? Now, how to measure inflation is something that we need to explore, and we will explore using the concept of the consumer price index, and the other concept is the GDP deflator. Two different indexes that actually they mean almost the same, but we are going to be differentiating one to the other, and those are important tools to understand in order to measure the price level changing over time, and therefore finding if a country is facing inflation. Sorry. Let's define the concept of nominal and real. Now that we know that inflation is making some noise in the measurement of whatever goods and services we are comparing over time, now we can talk about nominal and real. When I say noise, that means that if the cornflakes that we were talking about, let's use the example of the cornflakes package. Let's say if a country over time is producing 20 boxes of cornflakes each year, then we see that the country is really producing the same amount each year. It's not producing more, it's just producing the same amount. So T1, T2, T3, each year they are producing 20 boxes, okay? So their production is not changing, okay? However, what if we take into consideration the prices? Because remember that when we measure GDP or something related with the production, we multiply prices times quantity. So here we're talking about the quantity. But what if the prices have been changing over time? Remember we said in a certain year, the cornflakes box was 18 cents, but then the next year was $1, and the next year was $1.50, and the next year was $2.99. Then it went down, but it went to go up. So actually what we're looking at here is that if we multiply the price times the quantity, we will have a certain value. So this is saying price each year. of cornflakes. So if we are now looking at the prices increasing, then we have a situation that is telling us, well, actually, we didn't produce, well, we produced 20 boxes, but when we multiply the 20 boxes by the price of that year, it's giving us a certain information that this year we produced, let's say, $290. And the next year we produced maybe, again, 20 boxes, but with the inflated prices or the higher prices, it will tell us, oh, we produced $300 of cornflakes. And the next year, oh, we produced $370 of cornflakes. But in real terms, we were producing only 20 boxes. What is actually inflating the value is the change in prices. So the inflation is actually giving us a wrong information about the real production of, in this case, cornflakes. If we don't use cornflakes, but we use everything that the economy is producing, then we have the same situation. If the real production, remember the GDP from the output is remaining stable, but the inflation of the country is reflecting higher prices, then we have a value of the GDP that is not considering the real production, but is considering the production plus the change in prices. So we call this the nominal GDP. Nominal GDP means the GDP measured on each year prices, or measuring the GDP at the current year prices. Remember, the prices of each year could be higher than the prices of the last year. So now we have nominal GDP of each year, okay? So in terms of comparing the GDP over time, the nominal GDP is not the best comparison figure because the nominal is already including the inflation rate. Unless we have the inflation rate, and we know that, okay, we have 3%, 5%, 2%, whatever the increase in prices, unless we have that information, then the nominal GDP is not really telling us the real production of an economy. And we actually, as economists, we want to understand if the economy is producing more or is producing less. We don't really, well, we care, but we don't really care if we want to measure the production of an economy. We don't care about the prices, or actually the prices are making us noise over time. It doesn't really tell us the real story of producing more or less. So that's why we need to use some tools to subtract the inflation from the GDP, from the nominal GDP, okay? The nominal GDP or GNP takes already into consideration the inflation in its values, okay? It reflects already the increase in prices. So that's the nominal figure. So we need to convert the nominal figure into the real figure, okay? The real GDP. As you may be thinking right now, then the real GDP subtracts the inflation or takes away the noise or the influence in the value or in the figure of inflation. So when we talk about real values, we're talking about subtracting the inflation from that value. So we have real GDP, we have also real exports, for example, the real value of our exports. We have the real interest rate. Now we have the interest rate minus the inflation rate. Now we have a real interest rate. So all the monetary values over time, we want to subtract or to take away the inflation rate. So how to take away the inflation rate? We usually do something called a base year or a baseline index. So how does that work? If we think about a timeline, and let's say we have the year 2000 as our baseline. So we want to look at the prices of 2000 as fixed prices. Okay, we want to lock out the prices of this year. I'm using 2000 as an example. It could be any year, as long as we keep the prices of that year. So then we're gonna say, okay, in 2001, we produced X amount of GDP of goods and services, okay? But let's say again, using the concept of cornflakes, the idea, the examples. So the cornflakes, the 20 boxes that we produced, we're gonna multiply it not by the prices of 2001, but we're gonna multiply these boxes to the prices of 2000. We're gonna keep the prices fixed. And then the next year we do the same. And the next year we do the same. What are we doing actually? We want to maintain the production with a fixed price. So then we can compare each year if we are really producing more or really producing less because prices are remaining stable or remaining fixed. We are using what we call a fixed baseline year, okay? We are fixing our prices on a baseline year, and we are taking as a reference that year of prices of, in this case, cornflakes. But remember that in a country, we have cornflakes, we have toothpaste, we have books, we have what else? We can produce computers, we can produce pens and pencils, cars, everything that we're producing. We want to stock or to maintain the prices fixed to the base year. So if the year 2001, we produced 21 million of toothpaste, and maybe 40 millions of books, and maybe, I don't know, 40 computers and 10, whatever, Pepsi Cola. So, but then we are keeping the prices stable. And then what happens if the next year we produce 30 toothpaste and maybe 50 books? Because we are comparing it with the fixed price, now we're gonna be reflecting the amount that really is being produced with that fixed price. And now we can see if we produce more or less from one year to the next one. We're gonna make an exercise in the next slide anyways. So that's why usually we say, for example, the real GDP of your country, let's think about Colombia, for example, real GDP of Colombia using the baseline index of, let's say, maybe the year 2005, okay? Or this example was saying at 1995 baseline prices. So you will say the GDP, and then you put here 1995. So that means that the GDP of 2020, using the prices of 1995, will reflect a certain value, okay? Whatever value we have. So let's say if in Colombia, the real GDP of the year 2019, let's say last year, reflected in prices of 2005, will give us a certain figure, okay? So the Colombian currency, and that will be the amount, maybe it's gonna be 2,050 million pesos. So using the prices of 2005, this is the amount of the GDP that we can say is the real GDP of Colombia based on the prices of 2005. And maybe in the year 2018, the GDP with the base year of 2005 was, maybe it was 220. Now we're saying based on the prices of 2005, this is what we produced. And the next year, this is what we produced. So now we can clearly see that Colombia produced more the next year compared to the former year, because we are now comparing the real production, because prices have been stabilized or kept fixed in a baseline year. So the baseline allows us to eliminate the effect of inflation. And every time that we see a real figure or the real GDP or the real interest rate, anything that has the word real, now we know that it's actually the value minus the inflation, or the inflation has been subtracted or taken away to eliminate actually that inflated effect. Look what this is happening in the USA. This is the average of prices changing over time since 1996 to 2016. Wow, now we can see here, using a baseline change, let's say in 1996, what these guys are doing is from 1996, how it has been increasing or decreasing. So some goods in general have been increasing a lot. Look at this, textbook and college tuition. So actually education has become really expensive over time. Childcare has been expensive over time. Food and beverage also, housing, all of that has been creating or putting pressure on the prices of goods overall in the country. So actually you as students, you will need to pay a lot more every year because the prices of college tuition keeps increasing. Now there are some goods and services that over time have decreased its prices, okay? So TVs, for example, maybe the technological process of producing TVs makes each TV cheaper and cheaper to be produced. Maybe there's lots of competition that is actually making the prices to go down. So whatever reasons are making the prices of these goods to decrease over time is reflected in these blue lines. Overall, in the USA, what actually is making more pressure is the increase in prices of some goods compared to the decrease of the prices of some goods. So actually inflation is taking place. In average, the inflation in these 10 years that we are comparing here, 20 years that we're comparing here, has been 55%. So it weighs more the upward prices of these goods than the downward prices of these other goods. Let's work on this small exercise. Now we know what the concept of nominal means. So in this table, this is telling us, okay, the nominal change of GDP compared to the last year is reflected on this column, okay? So that means that the GDP has been changing over time according to these values. Now, note that this is a nominal GDP. So what story can you tell about this country increasing its GDP over time as it is shown here? You will say, oh, actually this country is growing 7%, 7.5. Wow, this country is really growing a lot. But what is the problem of saying that with these values? Well, it's not really growing unless we really know that the country is producing more. But what is the problem? This is just the nominal GDP. So the nominal includes the inflation rate. So maybe these figures are actually flawed because they are including the change of prices because they are comparing the GDP of each year with the prices of each year. That's the concept of nominal. So if prices have been increasing over time also, this is not really reflecting the real growth of the economy. So what information do you like to have in order to deflate or to take away the noise of this nominal GDP change? Well, maybe you want to know the inflation rate. So let's say the inflation rate or the change in prices from the former year is reflected now in these figures. Now we have information to see the change in prices has increased and the change in nominal GDP has increased. Remember that the nominal GDP already includes this increase in the prices of each year. So what do you want to do in order to find the real GDP given this information? Well, from the nominal GDP, let's subtract the inflation rate or the change in prices, okay? If we subtract these values, then we have the real change of the economy production. So now, if you help me here, thinking about subtracting 7 minus 2, that would be 5. This will be again 5%. This will be what? 4, 3%, 4%, 3. This is those 3 squares. 4%, sorry. 5%, 2%. So look at this last one. The prices in 1999 increased 4% in this economy, the general prices overall. But the nominal GDP increased 3%. Now, if we subtract actually this amount of nominal GDP minus the inflation rate, actually this economy didn't grow on that year. What actually is making us the noise is that this economy is facing higher inflation than the real production of GDP. If we think about a PPF and I ask you, well, draw the PPF of year 1995. You have information, you say capital goods, consumption goods. So in 1995, the PPF compared to 1994 did what? Increase, decrease? What do you think? Well, given the information that now we have there, we can say, oh, in 1995, the real GDP increased by 4%. So actually the PPF shifted out by 4%, okay? This is the increase of the real GDP. Now we produce 4% more capital and consumption goods, okay? What would happen in 1999? So if we were looking at capital goods, consumption goods, the nominal GDP, oh, the nominal was telling us, oh, the GDP was growing 3%, but remember that nominal over time is not a good way of comparing how much the country is growing, because we need to know if the prices were making some noise. So actually, when we take away the increase in prices, which was 4% compared to the last year, and the nominal GDP was telling us, oh, 3%, actually, the GDP of this country in real terms didn't increase. Inflation increased, but the GDP decreased. So actually, we have a shift inwards of the PPF. This economy produced 1% less than the last year in terms of goods and services, because now we're looking at the real GDP change. Let's work on building a baseline, okay? Baseline index. Now let's look a little bit more on the mechanical way of measuring the index that we are going to be comparing over time to measure if the prices have been changing or not. So we call it a baseline index when we refer to a certain baseline year, okay? In this simple example, I'm comparing the price of coffee in a coffee shop, coffee of 8 ounces, between 2000 and 2001 in US dollars. So take a look on this table. The type of coffee, they reflect certain prices on 1 year and the next year, okay? Some coffee has increased its price in 2001. Look at the cappuccinos and the lattes have increased. Maybe the milk is more expensive now, that is making the price of this type of coffee more expensive. The medium roasted coffee actually experienced a decrease in its price from the last year. Dark roasted increased its price, and the regular coffee also increased its price, okay? Now let's build a baseline index. So if we are told to use a certain year as a baseline year, that's the index that we want to use as our benchmark. So the baseline index, when we look at the concept of index, we are talking about a certain number that is going to be useful for us to compare over time and easy to compare over time. So usually our baseline indexes or indexes are based on the 100 or based on the unit. That means that the unit is our baseline, and how over time that unit is changing will give us a reflection of more than 1 or less than 1, or we can say more than 100 or less than 100 if we use, instead of the unit, we use a 100 value. So we want to convert always our baseline in the 100 value or the unit, okay? How do we do that? So in mathematics, it's very easy to convert anything towards the unit. So how are we going to be converting anything to a unit? Now, talking about prices, we're going to be using the adding up of the average. We can use the average prices of coffee, or we can use the total prices of coffee. In this case, let's use the total prices of all coffees that we are selling in this coffee shop. $2 plus 150, etc. That will give us a value of 75. Okay, that's what I'm doing is I'm just adding up all these different prices. Okay, we could use an average, but let's use the simple sum of everything that we are considering here as coffee. Because this is our baseline, we're saying that year 2000 will be considered now as our benchmark. Let's convert this 5.75 into the unit. How can we do that? In mathematics, everything that is divided by itself becomes the unit. Okay? So we just divide it. 575 divided by itself is 1. If we have one pencil divided by one pencil, we will become 1 unit. If we have 300 calculators divided by 300 calculators, will be 1 unit. So that's what we're doing when we're comparing our baseline, because we want to make the baseline the unit. Times 100, so we have our baseline index as a 100 base, okay? So in 2000, our baseline was 100, and now we know we divided the value into this amount. This amount is our baseline amount, or the baseline prices that we want to compare every year to. So let's do the same situation operation in 2001. Let's add up all these different prices. It gives us a value here of 5.95. Now we want to compare it to the baseline. So what are we comparing it? Okay, to the baseline price, which was 5.75. So let's divide it by 5.75. Now, what do you think? Is the baseline going to be more than the unit or less than the unit? Just looking at these numbers, 5.95 is bigger than 5.75. So we expect this to be a higher value, okay? So if we divide 5.95 divided by 5.75, it will be around 1.3. Let's see, 1.95 divided 1.75. Is 1.03. Okay, so 1.03 is our baseline times 100. So we have 103 as our index in 2001. At this point, maybe you have realized that I made a little mistake in adding up this. This is 5.70 instead of 5.75. I'm gonna ignore the mistake. Actually, the IB, if this was an examination, will say, okay, as long as you're consistent with your mathematics, that's fine. So let's move on. The baseline changed from 100 to 103. So what this is telling us, the baseline is telling us, oh, prices of coffee overall changed by 3%, okay? From the 100 base, it changed 3 units, 3 points. So we can say that the prices have increased over time just looking at the baseline. If we have, let's say, more information, if we have the year 2002, and we have new prices of coffee, now let's say the milk became more expensive again. Maybe the price of cappuccino is $2.50, the price of lattes is $1.95. However, the roasted coffee keeps going down. And let's say the dark roast remained the same price, and the regular coffee went to 50 cents, okay? If we add up all these prices, 2.5 plus 1.95, 6. Overall, the prices of coffee are now $6.60, okay? Now we want to convert this into the baseline index. Again, we're gonna divide it by the baseline value, which we have established as our benchmark. So divided by 5.75, we're actually fixing this price as our baseline, as a fixed price to have the new index. So, wow, this has been increasing a lot. Now we see the difference. There's a discrepancy between the nominal and the baseline, or the index, or the prices that we were using as our baseline. So this is 660 divided by 5.75. 1.14 times 100 because we want to make it 100 base. So 114.7, okay? So from the baseline, we can say, oh, this increases 14 points, 14%. The price of coffee in overall in general increased by 14%. Now, if we want to compare the inflation rate of coffee between 1 year and the next year, then we want to use a different formula. We want to use the formula of the rate of change. And the formula of the rate of change will be using the new value minus the old value divided by the old value. 114, I'm going to use the absolute numbers, minus 103, not the absolute, but the, the rounded numbers, divided 103. Let's make it accurate. 115 because 114.7 is 115 minus 103 divided by 103. So how much is it in terms of change? Is, if I'm correct, 0.01. Let's make it again. 115 minus 103 divided by 103. Oh no, 1.11. 0.11. 0.11 is the rate of change times 100 because we want to look at the percentage change. So that means 11%. Prices of coffee increased by 11% between 2001 and 2002. And what are we actually using to compare that change of prices? We are using our baseline index of coffee, or our 100 base index of coffee. At this point, you may already have in mind, if we're not talking about just coffee, but if we're talking about all goods and services produced in the economy, so now we have a whole economy producing coffee and producing, again, maybe we have here flowers, maybe we have here shoes, again, we may have here meat. So maybe we have here what, fuel. So everything that is being produced and sold in the country has a certain price. And if we have the prices of each good and we add up the prices, we have again our total amount of prices of each year in general. Now, can you imagine how difficult it will be to consider every price of every good sold in a particular year? That's a lot of effort and a lot of money. So what central banks do, they take a certain sample of goods. They say that's called the basket of goods that is representative of a certain population. And that will mean we're going to take those as the sample each year and compare how the prices of those goods are changing over time. In some countries, the sample is also geographically different. Think about in Vancouver, in Canada, there's a high proportion of Asian population. Maybe noodles are going to be consumed more. Maybe rice is going to be consumed more because of the Asian culture. Compared to maybe Ontario. In Ontario, they may be eating more beef and meat, maybe more hot dogs. I'm just stereotyping here again, but we're trying to put certain consumption patterns that are more likely to happen in different parts of country. And then there's a basket that is regionally assigned by the central bank. And they want to compare that basket of goods, how it is changing in terms of price. And that's how they adopt the CPI, or the consumer price index of a country, related with a certain basket of goods, and how this index, which is now we're going to call it the consumer price index of the general prices of this basket of goods, how this price index has been changing over time. And that is how we can actually calculate inflation of a country. So what I just said is, in this slide, we say the inflation can be measured using the CPI, Consumer Price Index, which is again a baseline index that has a base of 100 based on a particular year. The central bank is the one that determines that year. Some countries, this year is changing every 10 years. So right now, I may expect that for Canada, the baseline is the baseline 2010. Maybe they're going to change it next year to have a new baseline to compare the next 10 years. And then that's how it's usually used. Why? Because if we keep using a baseline index that is too old, let's say 1940, okay, many goods don't exist anymore. Okay, we may not be producing the same goods. Maybe some companies have not do not exist anymore. Maybe the consumption habits have changed. So that's why we want to keep updating our baseline, and then from that, see how much has been changing the general prices of each year. That's the CPI, but also we have the other way of measuring, which is called the GDP deflator. We're going to talk about this in 1 second. The CPI has a base year line of 100, as we said. If CPI changes from T1 to T0, from T0 to T1 by this amount, now we can just say, oh, okay, we can say that the prices increased by 5%. Now, let's say the next year, the CPI is now 107. Is that the rate of inflation? No, this is the inflation actually using the baseline time, but we said that the inflation is actually measured from 1 year to the next one. So if we want to measure the rate of inflation, we want to use the former year, which is T1. So new minus old divided by old times 100, that will give you the inflation rate, okay? The change in prices, that's pi. We use pi to show inflation or to note inflation. So in this case, that would be the inflation rate of a country using the CPI as a way to calculate the rate of change of prices. CPI as a value is a stock. It's a variable that we can say is an amount that every year can be added up, okay? However, inflation is a different concept. Inflation is a rate of change. It's how the CPI is changing over time. So the inflation is going to be giving us in a percentage value, and the CPI is going to be giving us in a 100-based value, okay? Could be 110 or 107, whatever the value of the CPI is of each year, okay? However, the inflation rate is between years, okay? 7% or 2% of inflation between 2 years, using the CPI as the change of the stock value between one and the other year. So we have an example here again. If the price of basket, remember the basket or the sample of goods that the country is using, just a certain amount, in 1992 was 200,000, then the baseline year in this, if this was the baseline, in 1992, then the CPI will be 100 because we're dividing it by itself. But in 1993, let's say the price of the same basket of goods, the same sample of goods, now changed, okay? Now this is the new prices of this toothpaste and cat food and whatever people are consuming on that year, that's the basket of goods. Now it's reflecting these new prices. Oh, now we see, okay, this is an interesting thing because the prices are showing us that now we have a different higher value of the same goods. So now we can divide this new price or this new value into the baseline value. That was the one that we decided to be 1992 in this example. So we just divide it and 100 times 100, now we have our CPI using the baseline of 1992 is 101.6, or we can say 102 if we round it to have the absolute numbers. So the CPI in 1993 is 102. This is the stock value. And this is again, the CPI, this is a stock value. The rate of change between one and the next year, 2%. That would be the inflation rate or the flow value. Okay, it's a flow, it's a change. Let me finish today with the concept of GDP deflator. as a concept, is the same idea of deflating the numbers using the CPI, but now we are using the total amount of goods and services produced in a year using the prices of a baseline year. So what we use is the nominal GDP of that year. Let's say in the year 2019, everything that is being produced has a certain value, okay? Maybe whatever value we have. That's the nominal value of the GDP. But we will divide this into the real GDP, meaning what we produced in 2019 using a baseline year. So let's assume that the baseline year in this country was 2005. So what is this telling us? The production of 2019 using the prices of 2005 will give us the real GDP of 2019 using the baseline of prices of 2005. So now we have the real GDP. If this value is smaller than the nominal GDP, now we see the discrepancy here is just the increase in prices. The nominal GDP is bigger than the real GDP. What is the difference? Actually, the inflation rate, isn't it? That is why we call the GDP deflator as the value that is telling us the discrepancy between nominal and real GDP. We can calculate the GDP deflator only at the end of the year, because at the end of the year is when we have this value of nominal GDP, because we know how much has been produced, and now we can just compare every single good produced using the prices of a certain baseline to compare it with the real GDP. We will multiply it by 100 because we want our GDP deflator to be using a base of 100. Okay, it's like the CPI. So now we have the GDP deflator. If the GDP deflator is using the 2005 baseline, so we expect that the GDP deflator in 2005 was the nominal GDP of 2005 divided by the real GDP of 2005 using 2005 as a baseline. So this should be given of the unit times 100. So the GDP deflator in 2005 was 100. Same concept of the CPI, but now we're using all the goods and services produced in the economy, not just a basket. And we are actually comparing the nominal versus the real, and that discrepancy is the GDP deflator, okay? So now we have here no discrepancy. There's a unit here. What if in 2019, the nominal GDP was higher than the real GDP? Then whatever value is this giving us, the GDP deflator now is telling us, now we have a discrepancy compared to the baseline year. There's certain change in the price level because the GDP deflator is bigger than the base year. And we use GDP deflator change over time to calculate inflation. But usually the most common value to be used is the CPI. It's cheaper and it's easier to find just a certain sample of goods. So now we have the formula of the real and nominal GDP using the GDP deflator. So I mean, we have the formula of the GDP deflator using the nominal and real GDP figures. You can read that. This is what we just explained. And this is the growth rate of the rate of change. Remember, new minus old divided by old times 100, we have a rate of change. So this is a percentage change over time of anything that we are comparing, okay? Could be CPI, CPI again, and CPI. So this will be an inflation rate. Could be GDP, again, GDP and GDP. If we're using the real GDP values, then we're talking about the growth rate. So whatever we're measuring in terms of time is using this formula of growth rate or change rate, okay? And we have our last formula, which we will use in the next exercise, which is the formula of, no, it's the same thing. It's just the formula, but using GDP as a notation. CPI, if we use the CPI with minus the CPI, etc., now we have the inflation rate. And we have the GDP growth rate. If we want to use the formula of the deflator index, now we know the nominal values versus the real values will give us the deflator. If we multiply by 100, we have a 100 base deflator index. If we want to find the real GDP and we are given the deflator index already, well, we just divide the nominal divided by the deflator times 100. That will give us the real GDP, because now we are actually using the GDP deflator as the number to deflate the nominal GDP, and that will give us the real production of the economy, okay? So now we're talking about real GDP can be found if we are given already the GDP deflator and we have the nominal GDP, we're just dividing it, okay? Multiplying 100. Remember that this is important because the deflator has been provided also a number by 100. Let's work on this exercise. This is giving us information about nominal GDP in millions, and this is giving us already the GDP deflator. So now the IB wants us to calculate the real GDP. Now we have this formula that we just talked about. Real GDP means nominal divided by the deflator times 100. So take 1 minute to calculate the GDP deflator for 2011. No, the real GDP for 2012, sorry, and the real GDP of 2013. This is what we need to fill in here, okay? Pause it and make the calculations, and I will give you the answers in 1 second. The other question is about calculate the rate of economic growth for 2013. Remember that economic growth is not the nominal change of GDP, but the real GDP changing over time. How much have we been produced additionally over time? That's the growth rate of a country. If we produce less, that's actually the contraction of an economy. Here are the answers. So here's how it has been done. I'm not going to stop a lot in the procedures because we have talked about that. But this is actually what we need to do in terms of calculating GDP and GNP. No, sorry, GDP real and GDP nominal and inflation rate or growth rate of a country. So that is given to us. If you were asked to calculate the inflation rate of a country using these values, what would you use? Well, now you have the GDP deflator, okay? So actually the GDP deflator is using a 214 as a baseline. We can call it, we can tell that it's 100 here, but it doesn't really matter because it's just telling us how much the deflator has changed over time between 1 year and the next one. We can clearly see that the deflator in 2011 was smaller, it increased, it increased, it increased, it increases. So we can clearly see that this country is facing inflation by just looking at the GDP deflator changing over time. If we want to calculate the rate of inflation, we need to make the formula of the rate of change using new deflator minus old deflator divided by old deflator times 100 to make it a rate of change in percentage. Now we have the inflation rates. We can calculate the growth rates. Now, calculating the change of nominal GDP over time is not really useful. Why? Because we already said that a nominal GDP is not really the best way of calculating or comparing a timeline. What can we say about this graph? The economy of the USA, how much really is growing between 2006, the first quarter, and 2006, the last quarter? Which value is more accurate, 4.96 or 2.38? Well, now we can say that the economy of the USA has been growing 2.38 in 2006 between these months, because now we're looking at the real GDP change, not the nominal GDP change that is already including inflation. If we subtract these two values, now we can have the inflation rate. Again, but this is the way that we are reading this type of graphs. We want to make sure that we consider the real GDP if we want to look at a country growing over time or contracting over time. Right now, in terms of recession, the real GDP of countries is actually starting to contract. The real production is not the nominal, but the real. I'm going to leave this graph here because we may talk about that later, but so you can analyze what was happening with these three countries, within these three countries, Romania, Netherlands, and Hungary. Look at what we're looking at here. Growth rate, or the rate of change of real GDP per person using the year 2000 of our baseline year, okay? Now we know that the real GDP is now measured here because they have stocked the prices in the year 2000. So a couple of questions for you to reflect. Which country is the richest country? Romania, Netherlands, or Hungary? Given this graph, can you tell? No, the answer is no. I don't really know which one is richer than which other, because rich country means more GDP compared to the other one. Remember, the income of one country is bigger than the income of another country. So using the rate of change does not give us the information about how rich is a country. Now, this is actually telling us, if I ask you, is this which country is going faster? Now we can say overall in this amount of time, you can actually create a story about which country overall is growing faster. Now, maybe we can just look at a particular year. Let's say in 1995, which country was growing faster? Oh, now you can say, okay, 1995, the country grew compared to the last year. Romania grew 8.95 compared to the last year. Compared to Netherlands and compared to Hungary, they were growing almost maybe 2 or 3% compared to the last year. So Romania was growing faster. We don't know if it's richer, but we know that it was growing faster. The PPF was shifting in a bigger percentage than the other two countries. What happened in Romania in 1997? Oh, now we see the GDP decreased by 4.32%. They had a recession, okay? Whereas the other two countries were actually facing economic growth of, again, around 2, 4, 3, 5%. Okay, so now we can read these graphs. Now we know what these numbers mean, what these figures mean. Now we look at rate of change compared to the last year. Now we have a lot of information to analyze graphs, which we're going to be doing in the next following months. And I would like you to read the newspapers using these concepts to think about what's happening in the world's economy. I'm going to give you and leave you with this homework. Calculate different things that this is being asking you to do. If you want to add more columns here, just to add the nominal GDP, the real GDP, the real growth rate, nominal growth rate, inflation rate. Again, this is not useful, but it's useful for practicing, calculating, and then comparing the growth rate versus the nominal. We have different years. We have the prices of each year. We have the prices of the other goods produced. Assuming that this country only produces TVs and cars, now we can calculate the GDP of this country. Now we want to multiply the price times the quantity produced. Remember, for each year to have the nominal GDP of each year. And we want to use a baseline year to compare the GDP in real terms. So let's use, for simplicity, let's use the year 2000 as our baseline year, okay? So now you should know what to do. We want to use the prices of cars and TVs from the year 2000, regardless the level of production of TVs and cars of the following years. That will allow you to calculate the real GDP each year, baseline 2000. Let's leave it here.